Hey everybody, hope you guys are having a fantastic day. Cool junk to talk about. So yesterday we had started talking about the Great Depression, how everything had collapsed and how it got like super awful and like it was just really bad. We're going to talk about what it was actually like for the people in the Great Depression today, and it is absolutely awful. All right. So let me make sure where I'm at. Yeah, so this was the last picture we saw yesterday. This was a line in Paris. After our stock market collapsed, this can happen on the other side of the world. So tons of people lost their jobs. And not only did they lose their jobs, but they lost their place to live. They were just like kicked out onto the street. All right, so people had to turn around and figure out a way to live. So what they're going to do is they're going to just like go to junkyards or anywhere and get as much scrap as they can and basically make housing that they can survive in. It's pretty intense to see these massive amounts of people and how they're able to survive when you have absolutely nothing. There's really no sense of how we're going to come out of this because it's all just awful. So here's an example of, they're called shanties, just a little shack put together to try to live in. A lot of times they'd go to like public parks or someplace people didn't care about, they couldn't be kicked off of, and this is where they would put together these housings, and there'd be a whole bunch of them. So they're called shanty towns at first. They're eventually going to be called Hoovervilles. So you hear the term and they're interchangeable in history. So remember, Herbert Hoover is the president. The fact that the shanty towns will eventually be referred to as Hoovervilles, you can kind of see who people are going to start blaming for this fiasco. All right. Well, I want to reiterate, though, as we talked about yesterday, the president doesn't have a lot of control over the economy. But when crazy things happen, somebody has to take the blame, and it's almost always the president. And Herbert Hoover took the blame for this one. All right. So this is a shanty. There are stories behind every one of these pictures. It was very common for people to abandon their family at the time. Each one of these shanties, each one of these pictures has a unique story to it. There is a woman named Dorothea Lange who, during the Great Depression, while everybody else is out panicking, she goes through and just takes pictures of people. Like, not like Edward Reese, who just went into people's houses and took pictures of them when they weren't paying attention. These people all knew that she was taking their pictures and they didn't care. They're just trying to survive. So Dorothea Lange is famous because she knew to go through and take pictures of people. And I don't even have a picture of Dorothea Lange, as crazy as that sounds. So most of these pictures are taken by Dorothea Lange during the Great Depression because she knew this was a big historic event. While everybody was panicking and trying to survive, she thought to take pictures of it. So we are very thankful in history now that we have all these pictures by Dorothea Lange. When she took these pictures, she usually has a story with them, and I'll do my best to remember all these stories. I know the stories were every one of the pictures, but I've just taught them for so long. I hope I haven't like misremembered them, but I'm pretty good on these. So husbands were very commonly would leave their families at the time. While that seems like a huge jerk move for the men, all right, let me clarify. There absolutely were some massive sacks of crap that would abandon their family. That absolutely happened. But what happened most commonly is the husband of the family would leave. You still have your typical life where the men go to work, they make the money, they come home, they provide it to their family. Women raise the children, take care of the household. Men go to work. That is still, in the 1930s, was still common. When the men lose their jobs, and it was mainly men because men were the majority of the workforce, when men lost their jobs, because the social expectation that men provide for their families, men didn't just go home and sit there at home and like, what do I do now? Their entire worth in society is providing for their family. When you have lost that, these men are in absolute panic mode on what are they going to do. The vast majority of men are going to leave their family if they didn't have a job, and they're going to travel somewhere to find a job. Their only goal is to get a job and send that money back home. So you have tons of these men who are just literally walking down the road to try to get to a bigger city to find a job. Like if this happened in Davie County, men would be leaving Davie County and they would be like walking to Charlotte to try to find a job. Well, when they get to Charlotte, guess what they're going to find? There's tons of other people that have showed up there, and there's also no jobs in Charlotte. Tons of homeless people. However, this is a unique situation. There's an actual term used for the homeless people in the Great Depression. There are hundreds of thousands of them, all right? They're called hobos. Now, that sounds funny today, like hobos, ha, 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 ha. Well, that's, at the time, it was a term, and the reason it's different is because the homeless people in the Great Depression, these can be doctors and lawyers and highly educated welders and skilled people, people that are extremely employable. There's just no job for them. So these people, they're not used to being homeless. They're desperately trying to find a job, or they are literally out looking for a job away from their home. So this massive amount of people, there's a unique name given to them called hobos in the 1930s. And so if you think about your typical like caricature of like a hobo or a homeless person, you think about somebody in like a ratty clothes or whatever. But a lot of times it's like a suit jacket, right? Or maybe a top hat that's all like torn up and like rags to riches type thing. It's very common to imagine that people like homeless people wearing like suit jackets that are all tattered. That is an actual real reference to the hobos in the 1930s, because these men that are leaving their families to go try to find a job so that they can get money and send it back to their family. They're not as worried about themselves, but their expectation in life is they're supposed to provide for their family. When they leave their home, they're looking for a job. You're going to wear your best clothes. You're going to wear the best stuff that you have, but then you're going to live outside in it. So this is where they would wear these suits and stuff, and they would be outside, and they'd get really ratty and torn, and that's where that image of a hobo comes from, is really from the Great Depression, is this massive amount of homeless people that are just wandering the streets desperately looking for a job. So this picture right here, taken by Dorothea and Lange, the husband had built this for his family and his wife before he left to go to a bigger city and try to find a job. This is in Detroit. These men here made an agreement with the owner of this junkyard that they could make this lean-to and all this, but the rule was they can't have a fire. So it looks like they're sitting around a fire, but they're actually not. That's a table right there. They can't have a fire because the owner of the junkyard feels like it's going to catch on fire and burn everything down. So all of these men right here, in order to survive the winters in Detroit, pack into this little building at night like hamsters at the pet store and survive off human body heat. So this is literally any way of surviving. Like there is like all the other levels of what you think survival is starts getting thrown out the window in the Great Depression. So this picture here, this is a man who has lost everything. He's a pea farmer, and we're going to talk about the farmers and how they had their own separate awful issue at the time. He had a pea farmer. He can't grow peas, and we're going to talk about that why. So he did not own his home, and he lost his house and had to build this shack, all right? He does own his car, but he has no money for gas, so the car's kind of useless. His wife died in childbirth, and he is forced here to raise the child. This one is one of the few pictures I have that have a happy ending to it. Him and his daughter there, they do survive the Great Depression, and they make it out. This is one of the few ones where that we have a story after this, and it is a positive story. So they do survive the Great Depression. This is just some boots sitting here. That's not somebody like face down in a trough. That would be weird. This is a bread line. So soup kitchens and bread lines were very common at the time. Let me pull myself up here in case I went off screen. Soup kitchens and bread lines were very common at the time. Here's how it worked out though. So Herbert Hoover from the beginning, all right, all of this happens. They're like, Hoover, what do we do? Can you help us out? He's very much a bootstrap kind of guy. He's like, nope, you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, figure it out. Now, we look back on this and we realize that, hey, maybe not the best thing for Hoover to have kept been saying, but based on what he knew at the time, here's his logic. He doesn't think it's the government's responsibility to fix this. The government didn't cause it. The government shouldn't fix it, all right? It's not that he is a hugely selfish, awful person and lazy and doesn't want to. He genuinely believes this is not the government's fight. The reason he feels that way is because he's like, in the 1920s, everything was fantastic because there was no government intervention, there was no government control, and everything was fantastic. Now it's really bad. If we continue to not do anything, it will naturally get better on its own. That's the whole concept of the market economy. He is like, I absolutely am not going to get involved at all. As the Great Depression gets worse and worse and worse, this makes him look worse and worse and worse as well. So he's very aware of what's going on, and he makes the conscious decision not to get involved. This is why they start calling shantytowns Hoovervilles, because the government is supposed to be for the people, by the people, in this massive catastrophe. The government's not doing anything by choice. All right. So what Herbert Hoover encourages is volunteerism. All right. Basically, he wants other parts of the public to volunteer to help out the people, not the government. He wants the other individuals to help out. This actually does happen, so surprisingly, because I would think this wouldn't happen at all, but it does. So there were some really, really rich people who remain really rich in the 1930s. It does happen. If you happen to be really rich and got lucky and your bank didn't invest in the stock market and some banks did not, you're still a gazillionaire in the Great Depression. Now, how safe do you think you feel in your mansion when everybody else is starving to death in the streets? Probably not a whole lot. So what Herbert Hoover does, the president, is he organizes charities. So he does use the governmental power to organize the charities. He doesn't pay for anything. What Herbert Hoover does is helps organize soup kitchens and breadlines. All right, this is a breadline. People stand in line all day to get one loaf of bread that can keep them alive long enough to get it again the next day. All right, so how's it paid for? It's paid for by the rich people who donate money to charities in order to fund this. Herbert Hoover helps organize this. He uses the government to organize this relief, but he doesn't spend taxpayer money on it because he still thinks it's not the government's responsibility. This will, as the Great Depression goes on, cause more and more hostility towards Herbert Hoover for not helping out and giving any direct relief to the people. But he's not being lazy. He's not ignorant. He firmly believes that the right thing to do is to not do anything, and that people will figure it out on themselves. He is terrified that if he just gives people money, like just gives them direct relief, then people just will never go back to work again and they'll completely rely on the government, which you still see that fear in today's society because that is still a legitimate belief of people. In actuality, that's not typically what happens. And you can kind of see how we've progressed from that. There's getting ready to be help given by the federal government during our current crisis to people that are really struggling. But there is no belief that this is going to be, that people are like, all right, well, I never have to work again because the government's going to give me $1,000. That's not typically the mentality, but that is an honest fear in the Great Depression. If the government just gave people money, they would never look for a job again. But Herbert Hoover, again, aggressively decided not to give direct relief, but he did organize these big lines that were common in almost every street corner in every major city in America at the time. All right, so it just keeps getting worse. African Americans, Latinos, we were already a nativist society. We're already used to being discriminatory against other people. When all of a sudden there becomes a fight for jobs, you start seeing the worst in Americans come out. Any excuse to discriminate was exemplified at the time. We already weren't real open to others that America viewed themselves as. So African Americans, Latinos were kind of the very first to be discriminated against. And to show you human nature, this is a picture of black people and white people working together as they throw rocks at a factory that hired a Latino person instead of a black person or a white person. So this is both encouraging and horrifying at the exact same time. That, hey, you know what unites people is hatred of other people. Kind of funny because we're going to mention this a lot when we start talking about Hitler and World War II. But this is a picture of anger at a factory based on the race of the people that they were hiring there. All right. So life in the country. This is where it gets like mind-blowing. So you're like, okay, well, what about farmers? They're fine. Like, whatever. You can still grow stuff. And that's what everybody would have thought. I mean, it's like the apocalypse, man. Farmers could grow food for their families, but 400,000 farms were lost through foreclosure. This is just absolutely baffling. So I don't know if you remember from the other day, in World War I, farmers had mass-produced food, growing on all three crops all the time. The problem with that is that if you do it long enough, you lose all the nutrients in your soil. Guess when? All the nutrients got used up in the soil in the middle of the country. That's right, during the Great Depression. So during the Great Depression, while everybody else has lost everything, farmers in the middle of the country could no longer grow food. All right? They just stopped being able to grow stuff. Not only that, all right, you're like, well, what if Billy over here decided to have done things right the whole time? Crop rotation. Billy's fine. Everybody else around him is dying. Here's the problem. So nobody had thought this through. And honestly, I don't want to fault anybody. I don't know if this was a knowledge of what could happen. So when everybody moved out into the middle of the country, they cut down every single tree that existed out there so it's flat as far as you can see. So what happens is when it's flat as far as you can see, these winds whip up. Like, have you ever been to the beach and it's always windy at the beach? But the reason that is because the wind comes across the ocean and there's nothing to stop it and it just kind of builds on each other. You ever been in the middle of the woods and it been really windy? Probably not. I mean, you can see the tops of the trees, but inside the wood, it's not. Inside the woods, it's not, because the woods actually stop the wind from coming through. I know it sounds dumb if you've never thought about it, but it is a thing. They had cut down every tree in the middle of the country. Now they can't grow anything, so it's massively flat in the middle of the country. And since it's flat, since all this land is flat, the winds will start whipping up. Combine this with the fact that, and this is the crazy one, it doesn't rain for like 7 years in the middle of the country. Like, that's like biblical stuff. That's crazy. So you have all this wind because they cut down all the trees. You have no rain, which makes everything like dusty. So it makes these massive dust storms that will just bury everything in dirt. So even if little Billy over here had been doing everything right on his three crop rotations, these dust storms will come in and just bury his entire property under dirt and kill anything that he had growing. It's called the Dust Bowl in the middle of the country and absolutely destroys life for any farmers in the middle of the country. And they had to like flee, and they're desperately trying to go and find somewhere that has jobs. All right. So hundreds of thousands of them moved to the Pacific coast on Route 66, and they're called Okies because Oklahoma is the main hit state in the Dust Bowl. So people are fleeing Oklahoma and they're going west down Route 66. That's the highway that's in cars. It's the only way to get to the West Coast. They'd go down Route 66 and they'd try to get to California trying to look for jobs. Of course, there were no jobs in California. And so the Californians weren't real happy that they would show up. So the Californians called the Oklahoma people Okies. It was almost like a discriminatory name to call them Okies. This is what would crops would look like. I mean, it was just absolutely just destroyed. So yeah, I'm moving down here before I start this video.
Between 1929 and 1932, roughly 400,000 farms were foreclosed when farmers couldn't pay their mortgages and banks repossessed the property. Thousands of farm families became migrant workers, following crop harvests to eke out a living. Then, to make matters even worse, drought, coupled with the overproduction of crops in the Great Plains, turned the area from Texas to Oklahoma into a dust bowl. In 1934, strong winds blew tons of dust from the plains all the way to the East Coast. Dust even coated New York City and settled on ships 500 miles out to sea in the Atlantic Ocean.
So 500 miles out to the ocean, people are getting hit with this dust. This stuff ain't no joke. This is a picture of like a dust storm coming at you. This is absolutely awful. So this is actually a smaller dust storm, as crazy as that sounds. But these dust storms will completely cover this house. This is another one. This is a bigger dust storm. To clarify, see this car right here? That ain't good. My understanding is this car does not make it out of this, and they get buried alive, which is probably one of the absolute worst ways of going. So because you would get buried under your car, and then afterwards it was just like a desert. They can't find out where you are, and then you just run out of oxygen in your car before you can get out. Absolutely terrifying. So needless to say, people were just dipping out of the middle of the country. This is after a small dust storm, like covering an entire tractor. I mean, it was just, everybody's like, no, thank you. I'm gone. So it's interesting at this time period that monopoly is created. The reason it's important is because it shows the mentality of the American people at the time. It looks like that capitalism has failed, that our society is doomed, or there's nothing to do. But then the game Monopoly comes out, and it's a good sign that Americans aren't giving up on the American ideal. It's just really bad right now. And I say that because, so Parker Brothers is the company that owns Monopoly. They bought it from some guy who made it, and they'd had it for like 10 years. But they never produced it until the Great Depression. And the reason they didn't produce it until the Great Depression is because there's a couple things about Monopoly that are not typical of typical games at the time. Number one, there's just a gazillion rules. Number two, it takes forever. However, in the Great Depression, guess what people have plenty of? Time. So Parker Brothers decides to release Monopoly and see what happens. So the entire purpose of Monopoly is to steal everybody else's money and make them go broke. Like literally what is happening to everybody in the Great Depression. So you think this wouldn't be a popular game. It sells like hotcakes. Everybody loves Monopoly. It's a huge bestseller in the Great Depression and becomes the staple game that we have today that ruins families. I'm sure at least one of y'all have played Monopoly since this whole thing has started. And I'm going to venture to guess it didn't end well, did it? But Monopoly during the 1930s is extremely popular. And it's really important because it shows that Americans still believe in this idea of capitalism. Like, I'm going to be rich and make you poor, get some, even in the middle of the Great Depression. So men felt like, I kind of cut off the wording here. Men felt they needed to take care of their families. When they couldn't because they got laid off, they ran away. Suicide rates in the Great Depression tripled. There were 300,000 hobos wandering the country, men that are out here desperately looking for a job. They want a job so they can send the money back to their family. Like, they're like, I'll survive. But my wife and kids, when they're 500 miles away, or maybe not that far, but they are way, 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 way away. They need money, and I need to earn that, and I'm here in a bigger city, and I'm a homeless person here looking for money to provide for my family. Women, and this was unique. This wasn't probably all women. I mean, it definitely wasn't all women, but it was a higher percentage than people think would have happened. A lot of women, especially affluent women, because their job is to raise the household, women weren't expected to go out and get things. Like, the husband is the provider. He provides you with money or whatever, and then women take that and then manage the family. Women now find out, like, there's just no way of, like, getting things. So a lot of women refuse to beg, and tons of women starve to death in their own houses as opposed to going out and begging. People who've never had to ask for anything ever before are now literally dying in their own homes instead of begging for food. And it's just absolutely amazing in an awful way about how people dealt with or didn't deal with the travesties that were in the Great Depression. So these are some pictures I got of hobos, just men out desperately trying to find jobs. And Dorothea Lange, again, took almost all these pictures. Another picture of a man just walking to the next town because there's nothing in the town that he was in. This is probably the most famous picture. It's probably one of the highest quality pictures that Dorothea Lange took. So this woman is called Migrant Mother. She has 5 children. She does not know where her next meal is coming from for her kids. Her husband has left, hasn't heard from him in months, doesn't know anything. They have no food, they have no money, they have no food, they have absolutely nothing. And this is kind of the image that is famous. The last textbook that we used, this was on the cover of it. Probably the most famous picture that comes out of the Great Depression is this one. It's labeled Migrant Mother, taken by Dorothea Lange. What makes this even more interesting is that after the Great Depression is over, Dorothea Lange and a lot of other people went back to try to find out what happened to this woman, and there's no record. They have no idea what happened to her, which is kind of crazy. To clarify, had she died and all her kids died, there would have been graves or something somewhere. People would have realized what had happened, but they never. It's like she disappeared, so nobody really knows what happened to her. People have a lot of theories. Most of the theories aren't positive. All right, so children became sick and died due to malnutrition. Keep in mind, this is not like what we're currently going through, where we're having to be quarantined for a couple months. What's happening here is this is a long-term, decade-long. So kids are like getting raised in this environment, all right, for years. A lot of kids get sick. There's no medicine. There's no money for milk. There's no basic stuff that kids need doesn't exist. Tons of kids died due to malnutrition. It wasn't that they would necessarily starve to death, but they're not eating enough food to make them really weak. And then when the first time they get a sickness, they die. Schools closed. I know that's hard to imagine. And child welfare programs were shut down. One of the biggest things that happened is teenagers, your age. So this is back before the internet or anything else. So when schools closed, like they are now, this is just, it's closed. Do whatever you want. But it's not a quarantine where you have to like stay at home with food to eat. There's no food. So a lot of the teenage males at the time, so when you go home, but Mom, I'm hungry, your mom back in the 1930s probably had other kids to take care of. Usually teenage females would have to help out the mom around the house or do whatever. But teenage males, mom's like, you go figure, you're old enough to get a job. You go do something. So without any school and nothing to do all day, these boys would just go out and get with their friends, and then they would just do crazy stuff. It sounds really exciting, and I'm surprised there's not more movies about it. There are books and stuff, but they're called Wild Boys, and it's like gangs of teenagers that scare the bejesus out of the rest of the population. So what they would do is they would just go travel town to town on railroad cars. They'd just hop on these railroad cars as they're moving, which is extremely dangerous. It's how you die. They'd hop on these railroad cars and go to town, and they would just like steal whatever they wanted. If they started getting in trouble or whatever, they would just hop on the freight train and go to the next one. Super exciting, a lot of adventure, a lot of cool stuff. The downside to this is nobody knows who you are. If you're in another town 1,000 miles away and you get in a fight with another gang, or you fall and hurt yourself, or you die, nobody cares. Like, if you die in that town, you get thrown into a mass grave with the other unidentified bodies that they found then to get you off the street. Nobody's coming to look for you to come help you out. There's very little money to pay for police or have any type of stuff. So when you look at like the crime rates, it looks like the crime rates actually went down. Crime rates only happen if people fill out forms for crime rates. There's no police to fill out the forms. So surely crime rates skyrocketed, but it doesn't look like it on paper because there were no police officers to say that there was a crime that happened. If somebody stole something from you, there was nobody you could go get that money from, or somebody stole something for you. There's nobody to call to help out or even report it. So, but the Wild Boys were teenagers that would wander the country. I think if we happened that again, they'd open schools right back up because the Wild Boys scared the bejesus out of society. It is 2 kids. Great Depression. So like the idea of Goodwill kind of comes out at this time period. So you couldn't buy new clothes for kids. So what you would do, like once a year or once every few months, you would go to a local area, and any clothes that your kid outgrew, you would take them and you could donate them, and you could get clothes that other people were donating that were bigger so that your kids could constantly have clothes that fit. It wasn't nothing new, but it was a way to kind of have an exchange for clothes, and that's what is happening here. All right, Herbert Hoover. So Herbert Hoover is going to decline direct relief, and we've already been talking about him. He does not want to just give people money, because if he just gives them money, he thinks they won't work, and he'll destroy their work ethic. So he thinks the best thing to do is not do anything and let the economy recover on its own. This progressively gets less and less popular as the Great Depression gets worse throughout 1929 and 1931, 1932. It gets worse and worse. Thought that the economy would naturally recover on its own. This is a picture of, you got Herbert Hoover telling the farmer, it might not be perfect, but I'm sure it'll help quite a bit, because he has this farm relief, it's a scarecrow, and it says hard times are coming. It's basically symbolic of the limited help that Hoover is willing to give people at the time. All right, so he takes some cautious steps. He asked employers not to cut wages or lay off workers. He asked labor leaders not to demand more pay. He says, hey, please don't ask for more money, and business owners, please don't lay people off. Well, these things are out of his control. He may be asking these questions, but if a business closes, you have to lay off your employers. If your workers aren't making enough money to survive, as labor leaders are going to ask for more money. So while Herbert Hoover wants everybody just to get along, this is a situation where people aren't really going to get along. He does create private charities to provide for the poor. He doesn't pay for anything. All right. He sets it up so the rich people can provide for the charities, but he does organize the charities. I got a picture here of Herbert Hoover shaking the hands of Boy Scouts. I put this in here just to show specifically that Hoover, he's not just sitting at home at the White House not doing anything. He is out actively talking and being in the public. Like because he doesn't do anything doesn't mean he's being lazy. He, again, genuinely believes the best thing to do is not do anything. Let it recover on its own. So here's the story with Herbert Hoover, which is unique. So there's a river that runs through the middle of the country called the Colorado River. When he was under Coolidge and when he was under Harding, he really wanted to build this really expensive dam on a $700 million project. Harding is like, no, that's a waste of money. Coolidge is like, no, that's a waste of money. So when he becomes president and the Great Depression's happening, he's like, hey, I'm doing it. And he spends $700 million to build a dam on the Colorado River. It is the largest dam on Earth. Again, people are starving to death, and he's going to spend $700 million on the dam. How do you think the American people feel about that? If you would suggest that they would be very angry about it, you would be correct. But this story has a couple different moving parts to it. So he's going to build a $700 million dam. Do you know why they build dams? So what happens, you have a river, all right? So sometimes rivers flood and then they have a drought and all this other stuff. If you build a dam behind the dam, right, build a dam behind the dam over here, there is going to be a huge lake that gets built. On this side of the dam, it's like a stream that comes out on the other side. On the bottom of the dam, where there's a big lake, big lake on this side, all right, and it's empty on this side, there is like a little trap door here at the bottom. All right. So once you build this dam, you have this massive lake over here. If you open this little trap door at the bottom of the lake, that's like 500 feet deep. Is that water going to come trickling out, or is it going to come rocketing out? It's going to come rocketing out. So all that water pressure just comes shooting out. That is the purpose of a dam. All that power As it's flying through the dam, it hits these turbines that start spinning these generators because of the natural force of this water, and it charges these electric stations and basically creates electricity. So by just using water and gravity, you're creating all this power that can create electricity. So he builds this dam. It's the largest dam on Earth in the middle of the Colorado River, spends $700 million that doesn't look like we even have, to build this massive, massive dam. It is completed right after he leaves office because this dam is going to be super awesome, and he gets no credit for it, all right? What they don't realize is when he spends $700 million, what's he spending that money on? Workers. He had to hire a bunch of people to build it. He had to go buy a construction company, that American construction company, a concrete company, in order to make the concrete for it. He spends $700 million and puts people to work to build this dam for him in the middle of nowhere. What they don't realize is that by building this dam, the entire region where this dam is built comes out of the Great Depression because he spent money on it. Right? When people who are starving to death, they get money. Guess what they do? They go to the grocery store and they open the grocery store back up. When the grocery store starts making money, guess what they do? They put their money back in the bank with the new regulations to keep them from losing it again. And gets the banks up and running. When you put money into a society, it opens it back up. So he doesn't. All he's thinking is, I want this cool dam. So he builds this dam. It's the largest dam on Earth at the time when he completes it. And it's kind of oblivious to the fact that while he is building it, the entire region comes out of the Great Depression where this dam was built. Not only that, after the dam is built, that region no longer floods because you can control the water coming in or out, which makes all the land around it much more valuable because it doesn't accidentally flood anymore. You can control that. It also increases property value because the entire region now has electricity that previously did not. So the Boulder Dam that he builds is so popular that after it is done, now he's not in office when everybody realizes how cool it is. All right. He's already out of office at this point. So he doesn't get the credit for this, but they renamed the Boulder Dam what it's still called today, which is the Hoover Dam. The Hoover Dam was renamed from the Boulder Dam to the Hoover Dam after President Hoover. To this day, it powers all of Las Vegas and a good bit of Los Angeles as well. It is an extremely important dam in the United States. All right, so that's a picture of Hoover Dam today. You used to be able to take tours and stuff, and like on the other side of that wall is a lake. Like it's really deep. Used to make tours and stuff, and then after September 11th, they were like, you know what would be really bad? Is if like some psycho went in there with a bomb and blew a hole in it, and then you would kill like 1 million people downriver in like Las Vegas. So now you can't take tours inside the Hoover Dam, but you used to be able to. It's like a big, like 6-lane highway across the top. I believe I say 6-lane. I have not been there. Maybe one of y'all have, but I do know there's a road that goes across the top of it. It's a very, very large structure. All right, so people start turning against Hoover in the 1930 election. So remember, he's a Republican. So in the 1930 elections, basically every single Republican that ran for re-election lost. And all the Democrats came in. That's a big telltale sign for the president. So he was elected in 28. So this is his midterm election. So he has 2 more years. But all of his friends just got voted out of office, and it's all Democrats. That is a big sign to a president that what you're doing ain't working. You got to do something different. People during the 1930 election started calling shanty towns Hoovervilles, newspapers Hoover blankets, and like empty pockets turned outwards Hoover flags. This is a picture of a Hooverville. So he realizes after 1930, he's got to get serious here. All right. He creates the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, which lowers mortgage rates for homeowners. He's like, hey guys, I'm not going to charge you as much to keep your house. Well, this is already like 2 years into it. This doesn't really help people because most people that had a house, guess what? They've already lost it. Thanks for lowering my interest rate on a house I already lost. So that doesn't help me at all. He creates the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to give $2 billion to get the banks, railroad, and life insurance companies up and running again. It's kind of a drop in the bucket. He needs to get these things up and running, but $2 billion just isn't enough to make a huge fundamental difference. But the Federal Home Loan Bank Act and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation are symbolic of the fact that he realizes, oh, junk, the United States government does need to get involved. But it's a little too little and a little too late because mortgage relief doesn't help people who've already lost their houses, and the Reconstruction Finance Corporation doesn't help at all because it's not enough money to actually help these big mega industries get up and running again after they've been just crushed. These are men that are working on the railroad all the live long day. Have a good rest of the day.